welcome to the session. Thanks for coming this afternoon. For those of you that have stayed on for this post-conference workshop from the Beck conference, and to others that may have come just for this event. Maybe I'll do a quick show of hands there. How many have attended Beck this week? Right, so most people. We did a session like this, we organized a session like this last year, and probably had maybe 50-50 people from the conference and people from other parts of mostly Northern California attending. So good to see everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kevin Luten, and I'm here as the Vice Chairman of the Transportation Demand Management Institute, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. I'm originally from the US, but have been based in working out of Australia for the last 7 years, doing initially primarily transportation behavior change work, but now behavior change also in energy, water, physical activity programs. But the transportation work is still sort of the roots of what I do and know, and so I'm pleased to have organized in conjunction with Beck and TDMI this session this afternoon, and very much looking forward to it. We've got 3 great panelists here, and I think it's going to cover a real diversity of topics, but hopefully they all fit together conceptually. So we're going to start off with Max giving us a bit of a framework of the role of transportation in the overall greenhouse gas energy sector emissions area, and talk about sort of what's happening and what scale transportation represents within that context. And then with that said, we're going to hear from Susan Handy from UC Davis, talking a little bit about new programs that she's leading up nationally and her experience with these issues primarily in the US. And then we'll sort of take a bit of a global step with Rotmann from New Zealand joining us, and she'll talk about some case study work that she's been doing internationally on examples of transportation-related behavior change programs. So that is our agenda. Certainly, many thanks to Beck for having us here. It's a great option to be able to have these post-conference workshops and have a room and a meeting place for that to work, and they do a good job of getting the word out about these events. So we certainly appreciate Beck's role as joint sponsors of this event. Just really quickly, in the Transportation Demand Management Institute, the primary location you can find out more about us is this website here, Transportation 2.0, which is the website of the Transportation 2.org. It's the sort of early stages of this website for us, and we're trying to do a couple of things there, but I can find out on this website, you can find out a bit more about us in the About section. You're certainly welcome to have a look at the, everyone.
With Benjamin, you can see.
Realize that? Yeah, that's probably all right. So, obviously you can draw your attention to the red button on top. Donate is always a good thing. We are a nonprofit organization. And then the green tab at the top I'll point to as well, which is around green building resources. And this is a new tool that's recently been added to our website, trying to connect people looking for a LEED certification to people and experts that can help them from the transportation side of the LEED equation. So it's very early days for that new tool. It's just launched in the last few months. We're trying to get more transportation experts and providers into that tool. And we have a link today from the U.S. Green Building Council's website for people looking to get LEED certification. Links over to this website so you can find an expert or provider in your area that can help you make the most of the transportation elements of LEED certification. So have a look at the website and sign up as soon as you can. Just briefly on Transportation Demand Management Institute, we're trying to do a couple of things, I think, to keep it really simple in terms of what we're trying to do. I would describe it as bridging knowledge and networking gaps in 2 areas. One is between sectors, so trying to bridge gaps between the transportation sector and other sectors, which is why we're here at this conference, of trying to bridge the gap really between the knowledge and awareness in the energy efficiency sector and what has been going on in the transportation sector, and have knowledge exchange between those 2 areas, but also other interfaces like transportation and health, transportation and the building industry, etc. So too often where we have these conferences that are focused on one topic, we're trying to sort of knit those things together in terms of knowledge sharing and professional networking. And the other piece of the puzzle is bridging knowledge and networking gaps between countries. And I think that has just stood out to me, having worked in the transportation demand management field in the US for 7 or 8 years, and then 7 or 8 years in Australia. And only people like me sort of moving around end up pollinating ideas between countries, and other people play that role too, but I think as a sort of an overall global industry, we do a better job of sharing information between countries, because my experience is what we do in Australia and New Zealand, what happens in Europe, what happens in North America. Very fundamentally different approaches oftentimes to changing behavior and promoting sustainable transportation. And there's a lot that could be learned between all of those areas and beyond. TDMI is a 501c3 charity, so we're always happy to accept your donations. And we were incorporated all the way back in 1982. And then just briefly, this is the group. We're a very small organization. We have no staff. Basically everything that we do is led by our board of directors. We've got 2 of our board members here. Nick Ranfos is our official technical cameraman. And Lynn Overcasher is here as well from 511 Contra Costa in the Bay Area. So welcome to those folks, and thanks to the rest of our board for their ongoing support and assistance. And that's enough for me, so we'll dive right into it. What we're going to do is have our 3 presentations. Hopefully the sort of sequence of them are going to make some sense and start to build up a little bit of a story here, and we will end with some actual stories from C. And then we've left a really solid chunk of time for discussion, and we'll just see how we go in terms of discussion time, and figure as long as the discussion keeps going, we'll stop at that point. So let me start off by introducing Max. Max Way is the program manager at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in Berkeley. His background is in electrical engineering, and he has an MBA from UC Berkeley. He's interested in integrating human and social factors into future low-carbon energy systems through greater transparency and visibility, and the total cost of ownership model, including environmental and health integrated impacts. And I first heard Max talk about some of the stuff he's going to talk about today about 2 years ago, and tons of stuff really jumped out at me from the transportation point of view, and so pleased that Max has been willing to join us today and give us some of his perspective and some of the data.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a great thrill for me to be with my co-panelists as well. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from them, as much as you are, I'm sure. Okay, so today I'll be talking about a personal vehicle or light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas emissions from a California perspective. I've worked at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for about 4 years in the Sustainable Energy Systems Group. So just to start at a very high level today, I'll just talk about the carbon budget. And so the IPCC just issued a global carbon budget for the first time about a week and a half ago. And there's a number there. It's 790 gigatons, trillion tons of carbon to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius versus pre-industrial temperatures with some certainty, some confidence level. So the good news is there's a number, there's a target that the world can align itself to. It's not it doesn't guarantee anything, it's just for guidance. And the 2 degrees is somewhat arbitrary, so I mean, we don't know for sure what's allowable or not, but it's a guide. The bad news is that we've burned up about 2/3 of the budget already, so only about 1/3 remains. And really, essentially, the world needs to be a net zero carbon after that. So that's the challenge. So I'd like to just use this as one frame for the discussion, for any discussion really, but particularly for this discussion moving forward. It's not just reducing emissions by 10% or improving efficiency by 5%, or we've gained this much over the last year, but it's really thinking about the longer term, the life cycle impacts, the cumulative carbon. So that's a slight tweak maybe on our thinking in the past, but I think the IPCC has seen the value of this type of thinking rather than concentration targets like 350 versus 390. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but anyways. So this is a little bit more direct, hopefully. I'd like to translate that, or try to translate that to a US carbon budget, and apologies for having a very US-centric focus. But historically, just for background, the US, obviously is a large fraction of the world's population, maybe 4% currently, and into the future. But the historical emissions have been about 25 to 30% of the CO2 since, say, 1850 or 1900. But as a fraction of this carbon budget moving forward, Now translating this to CO2, the earlier number was carbon. It's 41 gigatons, still kind of abstract. But now if we look at a 50-year time span and say, okay, let's try to achieve neutrality or carbon zero within our lifetime, so hopefully within the next 50 years. How does that translate to per capita or per adult emissions per year? Turns out to be about 3 tons of carbon dioxide per year. What I've done here is I've assigned all the emissions to adults, so I'm not assigning emissions to those who are under 21 years of age. That amounts to 150 tons of CO2 per adult over the next 50 years. So that's a number that I'd like you to keep in mind. So, unfortunately, at our current emission rates, the U.S. will blow through its budget in less than 10 years. The current per capita emissions per adult per year is about 26 tons of CO2 per year. In Australia, it's probably even higher, by the way. And again, bear in mind this is per adult, it's not per capita. So if you just look per capita, it would be a lower number, like 18. So this amounts to well over 1,000 tons per adult over 50 years, depending on how much reductions you want to factor in. But it's a factor essentially of 7 to 9x over the global budget on population weighted share, which I think is the most straightforward thing to do. Okay, so that's the gloom, and maybe I'm depressed too, and maybe we'll all move to the adaptation conference next year. But I don't want to leave you with that message and just talk more hopefully, about California. And let's look at 2 scenarios for the state. So this is the state's targets by the ARB, the Air Resources Board. So it's a plot of statewide greenhouse gas emissions as a function of time moving out to 2050. For 2020, there's a target to meet 1990 emissions. So it's basically to try to reach the point at which the graph starts at about 430 million tons roughly. But the more significant target is the long-term target for 2050 is to reduce that by an additional 80%, so go down to below 100 tons. So how does that translate into the global budget that I just mentioned? Well, if we assume that we extend that line to 2063, so 50 years from today, then the global budget for California at least is 300 tons per adult. So that's about twice the global budget that I just mentioned. So maybe that's the best we can do in the US. Maybe that's terrible, but that's California. That's probably leading the rest of the country by X years, by 5 years, 10 years, we don't know. So just want to share that with you in the context of our transportation challenges. Now, my colleague Jeff Greenblatt at the lab just came out with a very fascinating study through ARB to look at what are scenarios for 2050 with existing policies. That's the first line there, the flat line, which is, I can't see the color green, I guess. And then the second line, which is dotted there in bold, is with existing policies plus some additional, some extensions of those existing policies, some uncommitted policies. And then the third is all of the above plus some additional technology improvements and some further aggressive policies. So it's not a good, you can interpret this in different ways, but if you take that scenario 2, which is kind of the mid scenario, then that amounts to 400 tons of CO2 per adult over the next 50 years. So that's almost 3 times the global budget. But at the end of 50 years, we're still emitting. So it's a very tall challenge, but as Kevin mentioned, I come from an electrical engineering background. I don't believe a lot in the world, but I do believe in human ingenuity and engineering. So, I'm somewhat hopeful, but I think, time, the clock is ticking, so as you know, as you're well aware. Okay, so I want to step back now and take another kind of high-level view of the story, in a sense, and look at this framework, which I call a technology policy market framework, and I kind of stick in infrastructure with technology, but they're not really the same, of course. And you can think of this for a climate area or something like energy efficiency. There's a big policy thrust for energy efficiency. There's technology exists. There's markets, there's contractors, there's vendors. But what's missing here?
People.
Sorry?
People.
People, good, absolutely. So the happy stick figures. So it's missing, I'm not crazy about the word behavior. I prefer a different term because behavior to me suggests we want to change people's behavior. I mean, there's kind of the potentially risk in, social engineering. Well, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of social engineering already. It's called advertising. But anyways, I don't particularly like that term. So I just say go with human and social factors. Or you can put behavior in the box. That's a huge box. But it includes a lot of things. It includes culture, norms, values. It includes visibility of the changes. Energy efficiency is invisible. The Prius is not invisible. There's social psychology, cognitive biases. You go down the list. There's a lot. But all that's feeding into our what we do, what we buy, what we wear, how we talk. It's very, very, it's just embedded in us. And I don't know how many of you saw the first talk at the conference by George Lakoff and other talks about behavioral economics. Very fascinating stuff. So this area is kind of it's growing. I wouldn't say it's mushrooming, but there's a lot of, the interest is mushrooming, the funding is not mushrooming. Okay, so let's just take a few of these in turn, just a few, and talk about norms. So the norm in this country, in the U.S., is really, driving is part of the American dream. Driving is glorious, it's great, all those car ads, an open road, the rush of the air, beautiful women, you name it, it's very enticing. And really, we've been socially conditioned to that. And there was a talk on Tuesday, I think, about virtual reality, and that there are, the headphones you can put on virtual reality, and you can really be identified with a tree cutting down if you buy too much toilet paper, whatever. But I really think that advertising is really a very powerful influence of, a form of virtual reality. So how do we change those norms, and how do we say, how do we stigmatize something which is thought to be harmful behavior? How do we normalize something which we say is thought to be good behavior? So, just some crazy ideas. So, why don't we ban car ads? Okay, because they're so powerful. A few years ago, I didn't see any liquor ads on TV. Now I'm seeing liquor ads all the time. I'm kind of disturbed by that. I don't know about you, but it's really glamorizing. This guy, and he's so cool, and he's drinking vodka. It's really bad. And so, why not ban ads? They banned ads to children in Norway, and what we learned in the plenary talk from George Lakoff is that our neural circuitry is really formed by the age of 5. So if they're banning ads to children in Norway, they should ban ads to our childlike neural circuitry as adults. So anyways, it's just kind of a far-out idea, but I just want to share. Or what if we had a sticker that we put on cars with a scarlet letter sticker, a big G or a little g, and it starts with a small font, and over the years it becomes a bigger and bigger font, so that it's a gasoline burning engine has a big red letter on it. Would that change behavior? Making things visible. Take the example of the Prius and PV. You know that people like the appearance of the Prius because it's like a badge, it's like a marker, it's like this is my green bling thing. And the same thing with PV. If the PV, photovoltaic solar, was embedded in the roof, do you think that people would be as interested in it? They probably prioritize PV over energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is notoriously hard to sell. It's invisible. Nobody sees it. You don't even see it. You don't even sense it. There are arguments against it, of course, but okay. Risk perception. So, we judge risk very, very poorly. So, here's an example. Think about nuclear power versus fossil fuel power. Which is worse? Which causes more damage? Which is more news? Any thoughts on that?
In terms of current damage, fossil fuel power is absolutely
right. Exactly. Current damage is the key, right? There's this future damage. So we don't assess risk. So what if there are like 5 more crashes for the Tesla or EVs or the Leaf in the next month? Does that mean that EVs are unsafe? Not necessarily. I mean, you gotta. It's hard. So we don't. I just want to just call this out and just say that it's a big issue and complex. Okay, just looking at trends for US VMT. This is what I showed Kevin a few years ago. So since 1970, everything has been supersized in the US. Now all these trends of consumption and VMT track very well with 2 other factors, probably a lot of other factors, with debt in the US and with obesity. So we're eating more, we're getting bigger houses, we're driving more, we're producing more garbage. Things are out of control, right? And where are we today? We're not in great shape, and we don't have FK either. So how do we reverse these trends? That's a big challenge. Okay, so zooming in on motor vehicles. So this is from my collaborator, Chris Jones, Cool California Carbon Calculator, now looking at the US carbon footprint as a function of income on the x-axis. And it's just calling out that the middle wedge there, which is the greenish blue, you probably can't see it too well, but these motor vehicles. So motor vehicles is the largest wedge, and it, of course, gets larger. Everything gets bigger with income on average, as you might expect. Okay, so I'm just talking about behavior change a little bit. So I was very impressed with Kevin's talk a few years ago, showing that there were real changes, and it took a lot of effort and intervention among the population to get those types of changes in his pilot that he described in New Zealand. But here are just some trends for non-energy, well, not exactly non-energy, but let's call them non-energy behaviors, like waste, which is how much you're putting into the recycling bin, diet, food, and health and safety, and just focusing on, say, the left-hand column. So that's the column of recycling or recovery, which has increased from about 7% to 35% over the last 50 years, and meat consumption. So red meat consumption has dropped from 80% to roughly 65% over the last 50 years or so, and that's been exactly mirrored by the increase in white meat. So I draw a lot of takeaways from this type of data. Of course, this isn't perfectly matched to how you're going to drive less, or you're going to live in a small home, but it's just reference data to consider. So I see that behavior change is possible. There are a lot of factors. There's policies, there's technologies, there's information, there's norms and everything, health impacts. But it's interesting that a lot of these follow S-shaped market-like curves, market adoption curves. And secondly, it can take decades. So behavior change, in a sense, is like infrastructure change. It takes a long time to move people's minds and to get to them. However, I do take some hope from these slides also, because if you look and just imagine that you're sitting in 1950 and you're living in LA and things are a mess and you can't see and you're coughing and you're eating a beefsteak every day like Clark Gable. And can you imagine that the MSW recovery can increase by 5x, or that people can really sharply reduce their red meat consumption or stop smoking in a generation? So I would say it is important to exercise a little bit of reflection and possibility thinking. What is possible, and how can we get there? But if we don't think about what's possible, we'll never get there. Just a little bit of preaching, so sorry about that. Okay, so just personal vehicles, just breaking it down. So it's really the amount that you drive, your annual miles driven, and your emissions are then it's multiplied by the gallons of fuel per mile and then the CO2 per gallon. So essentially it's this VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, times the fuel efficiency of your car, times the carbon intensity in it. So I just wanted to highlight that each of these has elements of those boxes that I showed before, between technology, policy, markets, and behavior. The last two factors, I would argue, are probably driven by policies and technology. So fuel efficiency, there's this EPA great mandate to improve fuel efficiency over the next 12 years. Carbon intensity, there's a low carbon fuel standard in the state to improve the fuel intensity, get more, hopefully lower carbon alternative fuels like biofuels. And then for VMT though, I would say it could be all of those, but there's a lot of behavior elements and social norms, and there's probably some policy like land use policy. So the emphasis maybe is a little bit different for what's driving those. So I made a table of consumer level and policy approaches for reducing VMT, improving fuel efficiency, reducing carbon intensity from the consumer and policy standpoint, not the technology standpoint. And it's a long list. So there's transportation and land planning, where you live is important. If you live in a rural area, you're probably going to drive less than if you live in the heart of San Francisco. Not guaranteed though, but probably, on average. Mode switching, carpooling, telecommuting, virtual reality, maybe we'll see virtual reality and telecommuting, so Al Gore won't be flying around the globe every other week. Car sharing, dynamic car sharing. Fewer cars, if you own fewer cars, you will also have to drive less. If you have fewer workers, if your wife and you are both working, and one of them decides you have a kid and you stop working, definitely on average reduce your miles as well. but that's probably hard policy to say that you don't want one worker per household. Gasoline taxes and congestion prices. These are things which help reduce miles in other parts of the world, but probably it's going to be hard to use that as a driver for the U.S. just because even if gasoline is $70 a ton, I mean, carbon is $70 a ton, it's 70 cents, there's an easy conversion. So 70 cents a gallon isn't going to change the VMT a huge amount. It's going to change it maybe 3%. So I put that down on the list. Pay-as-you-drive insurance, just the notion that it's more of a variable cost for driving rather than a fixed cost. And there are studies showing that that will reduce VMT. Autonomous vehicles, I don't know what will happen there, we'll see. Okay, so then on the fuel efficiency side, I have things like fee dates, fuel switching, moving to cleaner alternative vehicles like plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles and perhaps fuel cell vehicles. Eco-driving, which means not lead foot on the wheel and driving in a more smooth manner. And maybe their feedback devices involved route mapping, telematics, integrating IT sensors on the road. I think hopefully our other accounts will discuss some of these at least. Okay, the other point that I wanted to make, so there's a long list of things that can be tried, but I think most of them are probably, I don't want to simplify, but most of them are probably difficult to do, at least to get a large penetration of adoption. So the other thing that I want to mention is I think it's important to think about and understand the benefits of greenhouse gas reduction from lower VMT, fewer cars on the road, and also cleaner cars and cleaner fuels. So again, think about the LA Basin, or think about internationally a place like Taipei, or Mexico City, which is really kind of in a basin, and it's not conducive to free flow air, and it causes asthma and respiratory problems, and it causes premature deaths actually. So there is a linkage to mortality, and so there's valuation that can be assigned to this, and people do that. Better health and safety outcomes, more walkability if you have denser areas. You could argue a higher quality of life. There have been articles saying that younger people are seeking more walkable communities or homes and neighborhoods. Less accidents. The fewer miles you drive on average, you'll have fewer accidents. There's a lot of that goes into that, but just simplifying. And the important point is that these may have more staying power as messaging than saying, oh, let's reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce your CO2 budget, or forestall global warming. Those messages only really are attractive to a smaller minority of the population, especially if you're in certain parts of the country. So the other thing I want to highlight here has been highlighted very well by Richard Jackson, among others at UCLA, which is that urban design and land use is really inextricable with public health. So Atlanta population study on the left there, more time in the car, you're a higher probability of being obese, and more walking, higher probability of being less obese. It's not the causal factor, but it's a factor. And also just to highlight that public health, we can learn some good lessons from public health in terms of community participation, commitments, engagement, incentives, and so forth. So I encourage folks if they haven't to look into this. Design Healthy Communities actually made a television program on PBS recently on this topic. Okay, so I'll maybe fly through the California targets or the California work. So just to say that there have been several studies which have appeared in the last couple of years on how California can meet its 2050, its long-term greenhouse gas target. And this is just a snapshot looking out to 2020 and just showing a few things, showing that from 1990 to 2010, the low bar there is light-duty vehicle emissions were the largest fraction in California at least, and they're expected to come down for a number of reasons. So we have the combination, out to 2010 at least, we have the combination of a cleaner electricity system and fairly stagnant fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. Projecting out to 2020, light-duty vehicles are still the highest fraction of emissions at about 30%. But we still need 80% reduction from each of those bars, so that's just the challenge, and how do we do that? So again, quoting from a number of studies from the California Council on Science and Technology, from Science and E3, and also from work that I did with the CEC in collaboration with UC Berkeley. Generally, the studies are finding similar conclusions. So for transportation, meeting 80% reduction is requiring a lot more production and deployment of low-carbon biofuels or alternative fuels. Aggressive fuel switching to ZEVs, so that's going to be hybrids, plug-ins, battery electric, or potentially fuel cells. And the fuel switching, an important point is that the fuel switching needs to be coupled with a cleaner electricity system, because if you have just coal-based electricity, for example, and moving to battery electric doesn't necessarily really reduce your carbon that much. Okay, but clearly technology, performance improvements, cost reductions, and scale-up are needed on a pretty wide scale, so specifically batteries and biofuels. And other pathways may indeed be needed, including VMT reduction and conservation. And they're desirable for all the benefits that I mentioned, but also as risk reduction, because all these scenarios are sort of like a Goldilocks scenario. This is all the things that need to happen ideally, and that can't happen technically possible, but unless the policy really gets ratcheted down really quickly, then it remains to be seen whether that all of them can be met. So if you assign a probability of 80% for all of these, and that multiplies out to be a 50% probability of success. So you want to try and do other things. You want a diverse portfolio. I think that no one would really argue with that. And of course, the caveat is that the 2050 projections are all wrong, because we don't really know what's going to happen, but they're just serve as guidance. And clearly, they're going to be very dependent on assumptions that go into them. And since these reports have come out, things have really kind of settled a little bit. The population growth is lower than expected. The VMT is starting to come down a little bit. I mean, we'll see if that persists. But these things are not fixed in stone. But I think these remarks still apply in general. So if you haven't seen this, for the state, the Governor Brown, released a ZEV, zero emission vehicle plan last year. So 1.5 million ZEV vehicles on the road by 2025. Those include fuel cell vehicles, by the way, and about 14% of the new vehicle market share by 2025. Yesterday, I learned from someone at the Center for Stable Energy, I forget the name, Tim Treadwell, I believe. He mentioned that the share of ZEVs in California has reached 2.2% in last quarter. So maybe we're on track at the moment. We'll see how that goes. And a lot of that is providing infrastructure support, which includes charging stations, education, financial incentives, etc., in the action plan. So this is just what we did for our latest 2050 study. We tried to extend these curves out to 2050. So the dotted line, which you may not see, is the 2025. And the green is the hybrid, yellow is plug-in hybrid, and blue is battery electric. So again, these are, I don't want to say arbitrary, but these, you can look at sensitivity of these types of curves. And one sensitivity is if we delay the ZEV introduction, for example, by 10 years. This is just the new vehicle MPG. So the left-hand portion is just tracking the EPA MPG pretty much for out to 2025, and then again, extending that per the market adoption assumed here. And you reach about almost 90 miles per gallon equivalent by mid-century. Okay, so energy and non-energy. So this is for the frozen efficiency case, and this is just our methodology. We'll start with the reference case, which assumes a frozen efficiency. And that projects out to be about 730 million tons of CO2. We're about 450 currently. And we break it out by energy and non-energy. The largest component here is transportation, but non-energy is also coming up, interestingly. And a progression which can reach the 2050 compliant case is shown here. And I just want to highlight that the key pathways are efficiency across all sectors, clean electricity, electrification. So it's really calling for a much greater degree of the electrification of building heating. So think about like a heat pump-based water heating in your home. It's also assuming that the oil and the gas industry is being superseded in this state. So again, maybe an optimistic assumption, but if the demand is really dropped and if there's not a huge outflow out of state, then that might be a defensible assumption, but again, it's a big assumption. Okay, pretty much my last slide here is just showing that you can run sensitivities, and I just wanted to highlight again that this is, again, I call it maybe an ideal scenario, but if any of these scenarios, like if the electrification pathway falters, if the efficiency pathway falters, if there's a lower supply or a higher carbon content of biofuels, you can easily greatly exceed the 2050 target. So again, it's just an argument for more diversity, a greater portfolio of reduction measures, and also how to get closer to zero carbon. Okay. So I just wanted to highlight again the importance of human and social factors in climate change and personal transportation. Several studies have shown a technical path to 80% carbon reduction in California. Personal vehicles are clearly a large component. But that conservation and VMT reduction is beneficial for a number of reasons and can help the state reach its goals, and is probably required to really reach an ultimate target of zero, or net zero carbon. Thank you.
We will have a broader discussion afterwards, but any initial questions for Max before we move on?
I'm not sure if it was in the introduction or very early on, you talked about total cost of ownership and including health impacts as part of it. Is that in the intro? And I was wondering if you've seen any use of including health impacts in regulatory screening tools for efficiency measures. When you think about electric vehicles or fuel switching, most regulatory screening tools have environmental or externality adders, but they don't include health impacts that I know of. Are you familiar with whether any health impacts have been added to screening tools to determine the efficiency of a measure?
The question was, do I know of any health or externality evaluations that have been added to rulemakings for regulations or standards or vehicle standards? That's a great question. I don't know the answer. Appliance standards, I know, do a 30-year net impact assessment, including life cycle costs and energy savings and discounting and such. I don't believe that they include health and externality impacts for appliances, but I'm not 100% sure. I doubt if they do for vehicles. I'm really not sure. I mean, there was like a 650-page rulemaking document, which I leafed through. Didn't read all 650 pages. I don't know, Susan, do you know? I would guess no, but I don't know if anyone else in the audience knows. I would guess no because I mean, the research literature, I'm sure it's not that, settled on, so I'd be surprised if the federal government took a method on, because it may be controversial. So I'm guessing no, but it's a great question, and I'll try to follow up on it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Max. Perfect. Our next speaker is Susan Handy, and returning to our sort of agenda there, also I did want to mention that we are sponsored at this event by Urban Transit North America, working in this sector of sustainable transportation, and I failed to mention in our intro slide. So we at TDMI certainly thank them for their sponsorship of this event. Helps make some of the videotaping possible. And this session, which we are videotaping, will be posted online at that Transportation 2.org site. So you can pass that along to others if they want to listen in at a later time. So thank you, Susan. Next speaker is Susan Handy. She is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy and the director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, just around the corner at UC Davis. Thanks, Susan.
I want to thank Max for that wonderful introduction to this topic, and I'm going to pick up on his last point, which is this question about reducing driving or vehicle miles traveled, as we call it in technical lingo. So, as Max explained, transportation is a huge part of the GHG emissions problem, and on the right you see our program in California for the different ways that we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see, let's see, okay, so transport is a huge share of the problem. And then in terms of the solution, you see a lot of technological solutions there. But as Max pointed out, that's probably not enough. And we're going to have to also think about reducing driving, reducing vehicle miles traveled. And in California, we're talking about that in terms of smart growth or better land use policy, better community design. So a few years back, the state passed Senate Bill 375, which put in place targets for each of the large metropolitan areas in the state to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks, which effectively translates into targets for reducing vehicle miles of travel. And it's pretty darn ambitious, as you can see. So what I want to do is talk about some of the questions researchers are asking and trying to answer related to this goal of reducing VMT. And I guess I should be honest and admit that these are the questions I like to think about. There are many more other important research questions out there. But let's just start first with this question about what's going on with VMT. As Max has already pointed out, there has been some leveling off in the amount of driving that we do. And it started maybe as early as 2000, so even before the economic recession. So this is interesting. A lot of people look at this and say, well, maybe this solves the problem. Things are tapering off and maybe even declining a little bit. Maybe that gets us the reduction that we need. But of course, it's not so clear yet where we're going to go in the future. There's a big question about what explains this leveling off. The economy certainly is some portion of this. But there is some thought that maybe there's something more fundamental going on, that there is some sort of change in how people are thinking about travel, their daily travel, and about driving in particular. And a lot of the focus has been on what's happening with the younger generation. So studies that look at vehicle driver's licensing and the fact that, when I was a kid, when you turned 16, you went down to the DMV and got your driver's license on your 16th birthday. Whereas now kids are waiting a little longer to get their driver's licenses. And at some point they catch up, but the fact that it isn't this, this thing they immediately need to do as soon as they're able to suggests that, yeah, maybe there is some change in how this generation is thinking about driving. And I think another thing going on that relates to this are all of these new services that are emerging that make it possible to use cars without having to own them. So car sharing and then all these other things like Uber and Lyft and Sidecar and all these various ways that people are sharing cars without owning cars. It does suggest that maybe this next generation, it's not that they're giving up cars, but that they're going to have a very different relationship with cars than our generations. And then of course there's the big question about driverless cars and what this is going to mean for VMT, and especially if we're talking about an aging population. Does this enable people to drive longer through their life? So lots of questions around this that we just can't answer. So lots of smart people out there looking at this question, and I think the really smart ones have concluded that we just don't know. We don't know if it's going to stay flat, if it's going to go up again, or if it's going to go back down. There are just a lot of different things going on at the moment that make it very difficult to predict this trend. So given that, I think we still have to think about what kinds of strategies should we be putting in place to reduce VMT. We can't count on whatever trend is going on to solve the problem for us. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. And as I said, in California, there's a lot of focus on land use strategies, the way we design our communities as a strategy for reducing VMT. So here's how the logic goes. We've been designing our communities for cars, and not surprisingly, people drive, and that's contributing to our climate change problem. So if that's what's causing the problem, then let's undo it. Let's design communities for walking, biking, and transit. That'll get people out of their cars, and that'll get us towards our GHG emission reduction goals. Well, is it that simple? Is it really going to work that way? There's been a ton of research out there on this question of the link between the built environment and travel behavior in general, and vehicle miles of travel in particular. This is data from a wonderful meta-analysis done by Reviewing and Robert Severo a few years ago now, where they put all the studies out there together, including several of mine, and came up with these sorts of elasticities. So if you look at the third row down, household population density, what that means is that a 100% increase in population density, a doubling of density, would lead to a 4% reduction in VMT. So it's sort of good news, bad news. I mean, the research shows that there is a connection. There's an association between these different characteristics of our communities and how much people are driving. But they are kind of modest. I mean, talking about a doubling in population density is a really significant change to the environment, and we don't get very much reduction in VMT for that. With Marlon Bournet, who's now at USC, and a number of other colleagues, we've been looking at the evidence on these various land use policies as well as a bunch of transportation-related policies, including pricing and some of the other things that Max talked about. And we've got these nice research briefs that summarize all the literature we've looked at on these topics, which you can find on that website down there at the California Area Resources Board. But the point I want to make is that, the big conclusion we made after looking at all of this evidence is that it's really not very good. And this is because most of the studies are cross-sectional. What they're doing is showing us that there are associations. So if you live in the kind of community that's on the top there, you drive a lot. If you live in the kind of community that's on the bottom, you drive less. But that's not the same as saying that there's a causal effect, that it is the environment that's causing that behavior. And in particular, researchers talk about the self-selection effect, the possibility that your preference for how you get around, your willingness or your desire to drive or to bicycle is influencing the kind of community you choose to live in. So that it's really about your preferences more than it is about the environment itself. And it doesn't mean that the environment's not important. We still need to build the kind of places where people who want to be able to bicycle are able to bicycle. But what it means is you can't take somebody from that car-oriented environment and put them in a bicycle environment and expect them to bicycle as much as the people who are choosing to live there. So this complicates our understanding of how much difference these kind of land use policies are going to make. So a number of folks, including a Transportation Research Board special report from a couple of years ago, have called for better research. And in particular, what we need are before and after studies, where we measure the change in behavior that comes about with a change in the environment. These are variously called natural experiments, intervention studies, policy evaluation, and I think C is going to share with us some studies of this type. At Davis, we've been trying to do a number of these. We did one before and after study of the opening of Target in Davis. It was our very first big box store, believe it or not. We're doing one on a road diet project. We're doing one on the West Village project, which is this net zero energy community. These are very hard to do. You're not collecting data just once, you're collecting it twice. We don't have control over when these projects happen. We've been trying to do the West Village project for about 5 years, but they haven't built the houses yet, so we can't study until they actually start building the houses. There are a number of other studies like this going on around the US. I'll just point out a couple of them here. Like I said, they're hard to do, so we don't have a lot of good ones in the realm of urban planning and transportation planning. But there's an increasing recognition that this is the kind of research we need to be doing to get the good evidence about what kind of difference these strategies make. So it's hopeful that we're seeing more of these kinds of studies. Okay, the third question, which is near and dear to my heart, is thinking about bicycling. And is the current bicycling craze going to make a difference? There is a bicycling boom in the US and actually North America and other parts of the world as well. So if you look at a 20-year span, there's been a very significant increase in, this in particular is the share of workers who usually commute by bicycle to work. So it is very impressive, and it reflects a lot of investments on the part of these communities in their bicycling infrastructure. If we just look at travel patterns in the US, you can see that we have a lot of very short trips that people make on a daily basis. So a quarter of trips less than a mile. Well, that's even walking distance. 40% of trips less than 2 miles. There is a lot of potential for fulfilling these trips by bicycle rather than car. And then you can look at a place like Davis, where we do have a very significant share of travel by bicycle. So we're at about 15%, well actually the latest data says maybe 20% of workers who live in Davis usually commute by bicycle. That's the highest number in the US. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. We're still at the top. And then the rest is some of our own data that we've collected in various studies that suggest that there is a very significant share of travel by bicycle in Davis. And how many of you have been to Davis? Those of you who haven't, you have well, it's a little rainy this afternoon, but take the train over there, take a look around Davis. It's pretty darn impressive. We have fabulous bicycle infrastructure. It's getting better. It's perfectly flat. It's very compact. You know, conditions are just hard to beat for bicycling. So it's not surprising that we have a lot of bicycling going on. So actually, you know, when I think about my own studies on bicycling in Davis, really the question for me is why aren't more people bicycling? Let's look at the not bicycling share and think about why they're not bicycling. And what we consistently find, whether we're looking at adults or high school kids, is that it has to do with preferences, with attitudes. So, you know, we put this question on the survey, do you agree or disagree with all these various statements? And it turns out that if you strongly agree with the statement, I like riding a bike, you're twice as likely to bicycle as if you only just agree with that statement. So that, you know, opens up this whole, you know, realm of psychology, and where do these attitudes come from? How do these attitudes form? How do you change them? How do you move more people into that strongly agree category? So a lot of our work now is trying to answer that question, you know, where do these attitudes come from and how can you change them? And I sort of summarized the whole thing with the old adage, where there's a will, there's a way. These communities are focusing a lot on the way, you know, making it possible to bicycle by investing in infrastructure. But planners who, you know, that's what they do, I think, you know, what the lesson from Davis is that they've got to also think about the will, that just providing the infrastructure isn't enough. We've got to think about how do you change how people think about bicycling. I think we're going to hear from Steve about some behavior change sorts of programs that start to get at that. Okay, so there's a lot we don't know about how we might best go about reducing VMT. But I think we know enough that what I'm going to do is sort of outline the skeletons of a strategy. And there are a lot of details to be worked out, but I think we can pretty clearly see what the basic steps are. And the first one is to make it possible to drive less. That's through good land use planning that puts us in close proximity to destinations. It's through good land use and transportation planning that means we've got good connectivity to destinations. We've got to invest in alternative modes. So it occurred to me when I was sitting here listening to Matt's talk that, you know, for most audiences I talk to who are urban planners, you know, this is what they think about all the time, and it's the next steps that they forget to think about. But I think maybe for this audience, this is an important reminder that, you know, the next steps I'm going to talk about, which are more about behavior, only work if you do this first step. You know, we can't expect people to change their behavior if it is just not possible. And there are a lot of places in the US where it would be very hard for people to drive less, given the way we've built our communities. So this is a very important first step, make it possible to drive less. But that's not enough. So the second step, we've got to help people see how to drive less. And this is where the behavior change programs fit in. You know, simply providing better information, we're getting better at this. You know, transit system information, for example, education, bicycle training programs. In Davis, we now have a transit training program for older folks to help them understand how they can use the bus system. You know, help people see how they can make use of these alternatives. Third step, you gotta make people want to do it, right? And so then you've got the carrot and then you've got the stick. So I'm going to go first with the stick. We got to make it harder to drive. Pricing, Max talked about this. It's a really hard sell in the US. We probably have to price a whole lot to make a difference. But if we're really serious about reducing DOT, we've got to think about pricing. And then, restrictions too. Make driving less convenient. Sometimes convenience matters more than money. University campuses are a great example of a successful approach to this, where parking is inconvenient, it's priced, and what do people do? Well, we have very high mode shares for other modes than driving at universities. And then the carrot, here's where some of the social norms and visibility and other sorts of things come in, the advertising issue. You got to get people thinking differently about driving. Driving being less attractive, but also the alternatives being more attractive and more hip and cool and the thing that people want to do. And this may be part of what's going on with this new generation. I don't know, we're going to have to see. And then, of course, I want to note that we're not ever going to get everybody out of their cars. Driving is still always going to be, at least in the foreseeable future, an important part of our transportation system. So while we need to be reducing how much people are driving, of course we've got to be doing the vehicle and fuel sorts of improvements that Max was talking about. But don't forget about infrastructure too. There's a lot of carbon emissions associated with building and maintaining our roadway system, for example. And that's an area where colleagues of mine at UC Davis are focusing a lot of their efforts to think about how can we reduce the environmental impacts of providing that infrastructure. And then the last point I want to make is that bringing these changes about it's a big change for the transportation field from which I come. So for decades, what have we been doing? We've been focusing on making it easier to drive, and we built this interstate freeway system to make it easier to drive. We're focused on moving as many vehicles as we can, as quickly as we can. And what we're talking about is a completely different way to approach transportation planning. And I like to think of it as making it easier not to drive. And it's focusing on livability, focusing on the idea of accessibility rather than mobility. And what's promising is that that we are moving in that way. Increasingly I hear folks from the transportation field talking in the terms on the right rather than the terms on the left. But it is a long, slow process of social change to really change how we do transportation planning. So I think that's it. With that, I'm going to wrap up.
Any questions? One or two questions for Susan, and we'll have a bit of discussion at the end.
Yeah, so very good presentation, thank you, and I appreciate your enthusiasm for cycling. But I'm surprised a little bit by the chart that you showed, the interpretation of the chart you showed about attitudes toward cycling, whether or not you liked to cycle, and your rate of cycling. In that, and from an interpretation standpoint, wouldn't it just as likely be the inverse, so that the more you cycle, the more likely you are to say you enjoy cycling? And in fact, we know from a lot of research studies that attitudes follow behavior, so you get people on bicycles and make it enjoyable for them, then they will start to like it and they will report that they are cycling because they like it. Isn't that a reasonable hypothesis?
Yeah, well, I think it's both ways, right? Kind of a chicken and an egg question. And as I said, we're doing some research that's trying to sort that out a little bit. So a couple of years ago, we did in-depth interviews where we took people through their life history with bicycling. And we were trying to get at that. So, so if they're at the point today where they say, I strongly agree that I like biking, what could we see in their experience with bicycling that would help to explain that? And it has not been easy to figure out. So we thought kids' experience, but there wasn't any clear sort of pattern there. We looked at crashes that people had had, and in fact found, we'd expect that if you'd had bad crashes, you'd like bicycling less. Well, in fact, what we found is that how you felt about bicycling influenced your reaction to the crash. So if you really liked bicycling and you had a crash, you still really liked bicycling afterwards. Whereas if you started out not liking bicycling very much, then you were turned off even more by the crash. But it still didn't tell us where did that really liking bicycling come from to begin with. So yes, the people who really like bicycling bicycle more, and I think it is sort of both directions, but it still doesn't really tell us how do you, so if you just get somebody on it, well, so what we need are the intervention studies, right? We need some studies where we put people on a bicycle and see if their attitudes change, and we just haven't done that.
A couple of other pieces of data towards answering that question. Back in 2004, Statistics Canada did a humongous study of people's commutes and their attitudes towards their commutes across all modes. And basically, one of the things that just jumps out is that the bicycle commuters were just off the charts more satisfied with their commute than anybody else, including pedestrians, which were the second highest level. And there was even a significant number, something like 10 or 15% of the bicyclists, who said that their commute was the best part of their day. And there was 0% of any of the other commuters that said that. So clearly, people have lots and lots and lots of experience driving to work, and that doesn't make them like driving to work. So that can't be universally true in the context of transportation. Another thing is poorly designed, completely amateurish surveys that I was very involved in of people who showed up at Bike to Work Day. I asked people who did not already commute by bike to work why they might try it and why they don't do it. And I asked bicycle commuters why they do and why they don't. And the thing that jumped off the page several years in a row is that while the non-commuters, bike commuters said, well, I might do it to improve my health or to save money or this or that, the bicycle commuters, absolutely, their number one reason that they do it and keep doing it is, it's fun. I enjoy it. And that's because the non-commuters don't have that experience, that visceral experience. They can't report that they would if they did.
Yeah. But it's also self-selection in that the people who are bicycling are going to have fun.
Badly designed,
yeah.
Not active.
Yeah. But I think the important point is there's a lot of investment going into infrastructure now. It's not enough. We've got to also think about how do you change people's thinking about bicycling, get people to try it. Just providing the infrastructure doesn't necessarily give us.
Perfect. Thanks very much. We will certainly have a chance for further questions and comments from Susan. But before we do that, all right. We invite C to the stage. C. Rotmann, I met in the last couple of years as we're both living below the equator. Neither of us are originally from below the equator. She is, in fact, also a marine biologist, so that makes her slightly different. For the better, we'll have to assume. But she has moved from being a marine biologist to a roving behavior change consultant. Her main projects are around collecting stories from behavior changers around the world and retelling them for the International Energy Agency's Demand-Side Management Program, which several people in the room are also part of, including myself. So I will let C tell us some stories.
Thank you. How many of you have seen me talk earlier this morning? Okay, so I apologize. I'll just go through the first few bits for the people who weren't there, but I'll try to be really quick. So, Task 24, which is what I'm talking about, is under the International Energy Agency umbrella, which is great. It shows a mutual beneficial symbiosis there. They have a great reputation, which I'm trying to destroy, obviously, by giving talks like this. And I'm hoping to influence them a little bit about taking a less technocratic approach to things. Our task is incredibly broad, so we look at demand-side management with all fuels, and we are concentrating on 4 domains. They are small to medium enterprises, smart meter feedback, building retrofits, and transport, which is what we're concentrating on today. It's very interdisciplinary. We're trying to look at all the disciplines and all the sectors. We're trying to bridge the divide. We really look at this as a human issue. Like, we don't even talk about the technology and the markets and the policies. No, we do. They're part of the stories. But to us, the human is the central component of this. And so we use a lot of like social media, social networking, and of course storytelling. So our target audience are not the end users of energy. Our target audience are you people in the room and everyone like you, which we group into these 5 main sectors. And so the secret subtitle of the task, which isn't secret at all anymore because I've been saying it all the time, is changing the behavior of the behavior changes. Because none of us are changing the behavior of the people, but we believe that we still need to change them a little bit as well to take a less technocratic approach to it. So, we have 10 countries that are financially participating in our task. You can see that they're very Eurocentric, although we do have South Africa and New Zealand. I'm working very hard on the States. They're telling me that the States already know everything better than everyone else and you're already doing everything right, which I believe is, there's definitely a lot to learn, but I'm sure that you can probably still learn a few things from us as well. And so I hope some of those stories will inspire that. We have 5 subtasks. This is basically what the task is about. We have an overarching expert platform. I will talk about the helicopter overview because we've just finalized that. That's subtask 1. And then we're also doing some more in-depth case studies. And as Beth Carter and I hope with her together, we're going to develop an evaluation tool. And then there's going to be country-specific recommendations. And I'm already asking for an extension to take this whole thing into 2017 and go into the countries and get much more in-depth and collect many more stories and actually do a decision-making tool that works for those different behaviour changes sectors and is actually a practical way of implementing it. So in our subtask, we have the inventory of experts. We have an overview of definitions because we realise that everyone understands something completely different when I say demand-side management of behaviour, and those can be quite heated when you go especially into social science disciplines with those kind of languages. You have to be very careful there. And we have this overview of models and then the translation tool, which ends up being storytelling. So here's the expert platform. You can all join it if you want to see all the work that we've been doing, all the presentations and videos. That's me being Austrian. I like to colour in states of the map, so I'm collecting experts. The red ones are the ones that are contributing, like Kevin. The green ones are the ones that are actually financially participating, so we like them especially. And then, of course, there is lots of stuff on the interwebs as well, where you can find us giving presentations and stuff. So, very important feedback. I've said it a couple of times. All models are wrong, but some of them are useful, and I stick with that. That's the underlying principle of our task. We do need to look at the world through models, but we need to understand that not one of them is a silver bullet model. Like there is no silver bullet technology, there is also no silver bullet behavioral model, but they're very useful. So, and yeah, my big thing, and it was my baptism of fire when we had the first really big workshop in Oxford. I realized that being a marine biologist, like to me, behavior and practice is something that I just say it, and it's what it is. And then I had all these social scientists from different disciplines in the room, and it was just like not good to just talk about behavior as if it was just behavior, like the way I understand it, because there's very, very, very accurate definitions of practices and behaviors, and you need to be very careful in what context you use that if you talk to various sciences. So I felt like, this is the Tower of Babel, and we're all speaking different jargon and different languages, and so my dream in life is to become the Babel fish. If you know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that's what I'd like to become. It's going to be when I grow up. I want to be a translation tool between these different things. And so what we found, and what was one thing that cut through in Oxford as well when we had quite heated discussions, was when we started talking about storytelling. And everyone really got into storytelling, and everyone liked telling stories. And even though it is a very valid social science tool, and I forgot it again, cognitive narratology, I think the learning scientist told me last night it was called. But it's also fun, and people get stories. Everyone gets stories. So Ruth, my co-operating agent, put this in because I'm now going to go straight into the stories. So we have 3 ways of telling them. We also tell the stories of the models that are being used, so the different behavioural models, and we flip them and tell the story from basically the stories as we see them being told from our case studies, as they're implemented, but how the end user would actually view it if it is basically done to them, which is what the behaviour changes are doing. And in each case, it's a short story. So, this is the monster, in case any of you want to see all these stories. There are in a monster document, which has a lot of really good social science, empirical analysis in it, but it also has all the stories and the cartoons that we've developed for this task. So for transport, we have transport stories from 5 countries, 8 stories. I'm not giving you all of them, but I'm giving you some that have used different models. And as you can see, the interesting thing about the transport case studies is that most of them were like top-down driven from policy, whereas same with building retrofits, whereas if you look at smart meters and SMEs, you'll find that a lot of them are actually bottom-up driven. And with bottom-up, we mean from utilities or from industry or from the actual community themselves. So, you'll get the hero story first, because it's from New Zealand, obviously. Once upon a time, there was a great big organisation that was delivering mail and parcels all over New Zealand called New Zealand Post. Every day, hundreds of courier drivers were driving 30 kilometres every year to deliver these parcels to grateful Kiwis. But one day, New Zealand Post realised that it was spending way too much money on fuel and that its drivers weren't being as efficient and safe as they could be. Because of that, they decided to start a fuel-efficient driver training program in order to teach their contractors to drive more efficiently and safely. But then they realised that a lot of the drivers didn't like being told what to do. Because of that, they very cleverly used the most respected contractors to become trainers of the other drivers and made it all about being good business sense. So finally, they took them on test drives and showed them that they could save between 5 to 40% of the fuel just by changing simple behaviours. And ever since then, there was an overall ongoing reduction in fuel consumption of 5% among the drivers that have taken part in the program. The end. So that's what happened in New Zealand. It's an obvious learning story because halfway through they realised that they were all contractors, and if the New Zealand Post, which was like their employer basically, told them what to do and how to suck eggs, they were getting pretty upset with that. And so by using their own respected contracting colleagues, they actually cut through them. So that's why we think that's actually a hero story, because for once we actually managed to make something really work. I also tweet about everything. Everyone had to write a tweet just to make really long case studies into 140 characters of this. And then we have a really awesome Spanish expert who is very good at like hitting the nail right on the head with very simple cartoons. So in case you can't read that, this one says, honey, I understand when as part of the new eco-driving program, an expert colleague is going with you anywhere, but isn't this too much? So the actual underlying model of understanding under this story, and it was implicit, not explicit, was the theory of the value-action gap. And so if you look at the story on value-action gap informing transport interventions, it goes a little bit like this. You can make the wheels of your car go round more efficiently. You're a good driver and should be proud, but you can become the best. You only need the right attitude and the motivation to act. We know you will want to act as soon as you see what you can do. We'll pull down the barriers you experience, whether they be social, individual, or institutional. We know you also experience constraints such as lack of time, money, information, encouragement, facilities, or whatever. We'll help you take responsibility and do away with your laziness, or lack of interest, or lack of trust, and the feeling that you cannot be efficient at changing your behaviour. So we will make sure a peer you respect and trust will show you how to drive more efficiently. Don't worry, only your driving will change, you and your car will still be cool. It's all about you and your car and your driving and of course your money. We'll monitor your driving, we've got really cool gadgets to do that. You'll see how easy you can save money, fuel and become an even better driver. Norway. Norway is actually the world leader in EVs. I think it's just because there's only 4 million people there, but per capita, they're winning right now. And how did that happen? So once upon a time, there was a very long country with very sparse population centres and a lot of roads called Norway. Norway also had 100% renewable electricity and a lot of money from oil and willingness to do something about climate change. Thus, the government, which had already put into place some of the world's best incentive schemes for electric vehicles, was interested in finding out how to lower barriers for adoption of EVs. Similarly, they wanted to get people to be able to time their charging better, as it would mean a real efficiency gain for the electricity system. Every day there were problems with the EV charging stations somewhere, and Norway's EV users were despairing of never knowing when and where they could charge their cars. But one day, someone came up with the idea of making a list of all the charging stations in the entire country and to hook them up into a single network so that one would be able to monitor how each charging point functioned, and make maps for EV users to see where they could find stations and thus plan for how long they could drive before charging again. Because of that, some funding was set aside to make an app that would be open in real time and developers were hired to create it. But then they ran into some serious technical problems, especially with the provision that the information should be real time in addition to being place specific. Until finally they got the technical details ironed out by making a whole new protocol for the handling of the data, and we're ready to roll out the new software, which was promptly taken up by a number of EV services and phone apps all over the country. And ever since then, Norway has been the world leader in EV adoption with some of the best infrastructure for charging, including the first Tesla charging chain, in addition to lucrative incentives for buying EVs, which has paradoxically led to congestion problems in the carpooling lanes. But that is another story. So that's the stories written by our Norwegian expert who gave us this case study. Norway, a lot of the Norwegian policies actually use the theory of planned behaviour. So the story of the theory of planned behaviour is quite similar to the one that we used for the value action gap, except there's a few differences, like you can become the proud owner of a fuel-efficient or even electric vehicle. You only need to intend to do it, want to join the others already ahead, and feel that you can do it. We know you'll act as soon as we remove whatever makes you feel you cannot do the right thing. And of course, what makes you feel you cannot do is due to money, lack of information, or lack of availability of the fuel or car, so we will tackle that for you. As soon as we give you and your peers more information, you'll of course all want to get a green car, right? Don't worry, only your car will change, nothing else needs to change. We'll only monitor the sales figures. We do not need to know if your driving is okay, or if you used a car ride, and even if you need a car at all. You'll see you can save money, fuel, and nothing else changes. It's slightly facetious, but I mean, if you look at the case studies, that's basically what comes out of it. So it's about changing intentions, which can be affected by outside interventions. Now, the Dutch drivers. Once upon a time in a country full of speedsters called the Netherlands, eco-driving was a practice for organic, whole-grain, muesli-eating, animal rights activists, or basically hippies. If there's even the slightest bit of testosterone in your blood, you'll make your engine roar, they say. Every day these proud Dutchmen would spill way too much gasoline during their drive so as to feel their freedom and protect their status as the alpha male in the concrete jungle. But one day the national government decided to start a campaign to promote more economical driving. After all, too much gas was spilled, too many greenhouse gases were emitted, and too many particles were set free to pollute the cities. The campaign basically showed that you can be a tough guy even when driving economically, which is why they were using social marketing with the Dukes of Hazzard, but in Holland, in front of windmills and stuff. Furthermore, training sessions were offered to learn the new way of driving. These techniques became a part of the driving school curriculum, and fuel-saving technology such as feedback systems and tyre pressure controls were promoted. So this was a very comprehensive toolbox of interventions. Because of that, between 2.2 and 3.75 million tonnes of CO2 emissions were avoided through this project between 2000 and 2009. The cost for the campaign were below 10 euros per tonne of CO2, which is a very cheap solution to the problem. 69% of all drivers in the Netherlands used one or more principles of eco-driving in 2009, and 84% were familiar with the concept. The campaign was a roaring success. But then, due to a change in government after 2008, this success declined. This can largely be ascribed to the budget cuts and the changing course of Dutch policy. Technology instead of behaviour as a solution, and increasing the speed limit from 120 to 130 km an hour, which sent a very confusing message to drivers. But still, eco-driving is now embedded in the Dutch society. The implementation on different levels, such as the integration of the techniques in driving schools and the support of sector organisations such as AA Patrol, were a key factor of this change in social norm. And ever since then, you can be a tough guy whilst driving economically in Holland. And a nice extra, it will save you some money too. The end. So it's about reducing fuel consumption, but tackling the car's status. That's what it really was about. And Juan draws this thing and he basically said, seems that the boss relies a little too much on his SUV to feel respected. And this is actually based on it was explicitly based on a psychological model called Marianne Sacks's descriptive theory. I don't know how many of you know that. I didn't know it before I saw this case study. And the story goes something like this. We know your car makes your world go around, and it still can, but slightly differently. And guess what? You'll be even more in control than before. You just need to rethink if the way you drive really is the best way to treat your car. We know you'll act as soon as we train you and show you how to take even better care of your beloved car. Do not worry about those other drivers. They form the 99.9% that are really bad at driving. Do not compare yourself to them. You know there are really cool ways to find out how good this new driving is for your car's engine and your wallet too. Don't worry, only your driving will change. The car stays the same. You might even pimp it with the savings you yield. It's all about you and your car and of course your money. The environment and road safety? Oh well, you will contribute to that as well. Sorry about that. You can do all the monitoring and even compete with yourself or pals on the road. Do not worry, we will not touch your car. We know what it means to you. If you want to know what your impact is, we'll use boring stats such as traffic accidents, not saying you caused them before, of course, or emission reductions that is good for the kids with asthma. And now, sorry, one last one in Wellington because that was for Sarah, because we were talking about biking before. So, once upon a time there was the coolest little capital in the world called Wellington. One of the things that wasn't so cool about Wellington was the traffic. Every day there were a lot of people driving their cars to the city for commuting. A lot of them were alone inside their car and often got stuck in traffic during peak hour. But one day, in 2010, the Greater Wellington Regional Council and a bunch of partners came up with the great idea to start a mode switching program that focused on getting a specific target group of people to walk or cycle instead of driving. Because of that, they started competitions, goal setting, motivational groups, and used a whole big toolbox of different models and theories of change in order to get the best results. But then, they realised that people weren't very interested in being super sporty or reduce CO2 if the trade-off was feeling inconvenienced. Until finally, they came at it with a health and well-being angle and talking about what normal people could achieve rather than boasting about cycling 50 kilometres a day clad in lurid lycra. This is a cartoon of our Prime Minister of New Zealand who made a very bad boo-boo when he minced down a fashion runway in a pink shirt and he was kind of like imitating gays. And so this is actually a cartoon taking the mickey out of him doing that. But he also he had a job summit just after they came into power to beat the recession, and the one thing they came up with was to build a cycleway from like the bottom of New Zealand all the way to the top. That was like the job creation scheme. They haven't built a single kilometre of it yet, but that's the New Zealand backstory to this cartoon. And ever since then, it was shown that the target group of people indeed took the program lessons to heart and they walked and cycled much more than they did before. A reduction in car trips of 20% and a corresponding increase in active travel have been consistently achieved with this group since the program's launch in 2010. So 20% consistent, that's pretty good. However, the big issue remaining is still that the coolest little capital needs better public transport and cycleways before this becomes the real social norm, the end. So that's what you were talking about. And they used, there's one in this cartoon. Yes, George, I know you support the active A to B program, but this time you've really gone too far. And the toilet of the car is there miles away. There was a story about norm activation theory, so we know you care about the wheels, but you also care about the planet, other drivers, your boss, your kids. You like to help even if there isn't any money in it for you. You like to feel that you're doing the right thing, and some of that you may have learned from others in society. You may even feel guilty if you don't do the right thing. We can activate your altruistic nature by making you aware of the consequences of your own action for others, but you will weigh up the personal cost of acting, which may stop you from taking responsibility. And then very lastly about the Vikings, and then I promise I shut up. That's about congestion charging. So once upon a time there was the city of Stockholm, which was gorgeous, but had way too many traffic jams. Every day more and more Volvos and Saabs tried to drive into the not so well planned city. Well, the Vikings didn't have cars after all. People got very frustrated. But one day the national and local governments decided to try to kill the behemoth that was the traffic chaos in Stockholm. Because of that, a comprehensive congestion charge pilot was introduced. But then, car commuters who travelled in from the outside and felt that they had no alternatives and turned sour for several reasons. Because of that, policymakers realised that they should also improve public transport, park and ride schemes, etc. to make it easier to travel without a car. So finally, the improved social acceptability, thanks to the comprehensive toolbox of measures, enabled the politicians to implement congestion charges on a permanent basis. And ever since then, the improved social acceptability, thanks to and Stockholm's air is almost as fresh as when the Vikings lived. The end. that kind of turned a little bit into a love story. Although the last thing I heard from my Stockholm expert who gave me that story was a newspaper article that said that the taxi drivers are now revolting against the congestion charge. So maybe not a love story yet. And there is one cartoon that says, "I'd love to be an astronaut when I grow up. I can't imagine any other way of breathing fresh air." So what are some of the similar elements from these stories? So they're mostly psychological theory underpinned interventions. They focus on the needs and the meaning attribution of the car and its use, which is very important. The status of the car is hugely important. Pre-scoping, found that pre-scoping is absolutely essential, otherwise you won't be able to tell if there was a difference, and also not how to target the right target audience. You need to focus on concrete actions. It's about capacity building, not just about sustainability guidelines. Sustainability isn't always a good message when you talk about taking people's car away or making them change how they drive. It's about targeting and visualizing the information deficit, as we already heard. It's about leveraging moments of change. That's really important in anything, because especially our car use is so habitual that, and you'll know it, I mean, once you're a good driver, you just drive completely routinely. And so, I mean, I find myself actually driving to places that are the opposite where I wanted to go, just because I ended up driving to work, which I worked at for 3 years, you know, just because I couldn't. That's not a good example, though. I should do that on a bike, shouldn't I? See, on a bike, yeah, I would realize immediately if I start doing that. Anyway, it's about nudging, and there's a picture of it, you know, a good nudge, which is, you know, the peanuts in 3D, but it like kind of makes you slow down. There's a focus on lifestyles, which is really important, that you need to take into account, and then of course the social norms and commitment. We also did, and I know you can't read that, but what we did in each of our case studies is we took on all the evaluation metrics that we found, and we looked at the conventional monitoring of transport studies, which were usually the more neoclassical, rational, kind of man-chosen ones, which are, you know, the total number of EVs sold, the congestion decrease, the familiarity with the campaign, the cost of the measure, the reduction of CO2, and then we looked at the more systemic case studies, and what they did, and there you find that it's all of these monitoring metrics, but also things like the number of drives in the rush hour, the higher safety due to higher accessibility, the improvement of air quality, the commitment and persistence of commitment, the changes in the symbolic meaning attributed to a car, bike, bus or train, the fuel burn rate, increasing the regional economy, perceptions of urban traffic, increased car sharing, health benefits, economic benefits for drivers, time saved for drivers, social benefits, smoking cessation, when you focus on the modal shift, somehow there was some relationships with that, decreased car changes, changes in social norms, etc. So there's a lot more that you usually look at when you create a more systemic program rather than a more like very top-down, you just put in a congestion charge and leave it at that. So. And we also came up with some recommendations, and these are the short versions of them. And it's basically like, cars mean everything to a lot of people, so don't take away the wheels, or don't be seen to take away the wheels. An energy-efficient car can be sexy, as we all know, because cars reflect lifestyles. Using a toolbox of interventions that work together, you need more tools to fix the car. Active coaching the trusted peers is key. Focus on concrete actions, you know, pre-scope and train, visualize the gap between the actual and the goal behavior. Make smart driving the social norm. Leverage change moments. A new car or a new license is a really good, so that Dutch program was really good because we put it in the driver's curriculum. Changing the institutional infrastructure environment, as we heard, it's hugely important because it's not just about the car. Creating that sense of community amongst drivers is really important, and I think there's a lot of messages around air pollution and stuff where you make it about an altruistic thing. It's not just you in the car, you're actually part, or safety as well, you know, you're a part of a wider community. Yeah, there's always perverse outcomes, people can break everything, that's just a rule. And yeah, money ain't everything. And that's pretty much it. And if you want to hear any more of our stories, that's Ruth, my cooperating agents, they're all in the Monster. Thank you.
Get the panel back up here, but to start off the discussion, particular questions for C coming out of that many stories.
I have a question. Yeah, so I was really interested in the use of the theories and wondering if they were used used ahead of time to design interventions, or were they used more after the fact to understand what had happened?
Both. So when we collected all the case studies, we created a template where people had to fill in all these questions. And so we asked about the theory that was used, and a lot of them didn't know which one it was. And so when we talked to them about the case studies, we kind of went, yeah, that's the theory of planned behaviour, and talked them through it, and they were like, yes, no, that's what we mean. So they were implicitly used theories. But then there was actually quite a few who had explicitly used theories like the active ATV story in Wellington, where they changed driving. They had like Doug Mackenzie Moore, they had Social Norma, Cialdini. They actually used them to create the program and to fiddle with the program every year to increase its uptake in the Manchester. So I think what we found is that generally the ones that did use theories explicitly were more successful because you could also evaluate more explicitly, according to what you expected from the theory. So, yeah.
So a nice framework for...
Yeah. So, as I said, some models are really useful, and they are certainly useful in terms of designing something and evaluating it, and then you're able to iterate it and maybe throw in a few more models or target better or tailor it better. And so I think it's just like, you need to pilot and then just make it a living thing. And that's what the Stockholm congestion pilot did. Because at first the pilot itself, which was just about money, it wasn't such a good thing, but then when they started listening to the people and listening to the complaints and implementing some of the other things, that's when it became, so successful that it's now actually the law.
Other questions? Ideas? Things we want to kick around? Go ahead.
So this is a question for Susan, and I'm from Cool Davis.
Oh,
so
you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do. And I you're in a university environment, and you do a lot of things in studying what's going on in the university, and then you also do a lot of work that's embedded in the community. And I know recently you've been involved in community planning, activities around parking, and we have a project in our community that's a designed. We're at least talking about what is the design of a sustainable community and how does transportation fit into that. And so I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the new standards that we're trying to hit in California, and where we're going, and this sort of interface between the ideal and what we think might be the ideal, and trying to get there, and then the reality of really embedding it in planning activities in communities. So
that's a nice little easily answered question. Just first a little reflection on Davis. It's a pretty amazingly planned place from U.S. standards or California standards. We just look at all the different things they did right. But it still can be incredibly frustrating. So I had a student who, for his master's thesis, sort of put the story together of how Davis came to be the bicycling capital of the U.S. And his basic conclusion at the end was, and now we're resting on our laurels, that the city officials had basically decided, it was good enough, and why should we invest anything more in it? And we've since turned that around, and the advocacy group came along and has really pushed some further improvements to the system. So I think it's just a really good example of how hard it can be. I talked about getting the people in Davis to take advantage of this great opportunity to get out of their cars. That's challenging to do, but also getting the city to do everything it could be doing, even in a place that's as good as it is, and sort of have that tradition, that can be really hard too. So it's a great model, but it also just, I think there's a negative side to the story. The other thing I wanted to, which I ended up not really emphasizing, but both of my co-panelists talked about, were sort of these, the co-benefits or the other reasons to do all of this stuff. So, California has really emphasized this idea of land use policy, better community design as a strategy for GHG emission reduction. But I think what's really pushing the changes in California on that front are not so much just GHG reduction, but all these other things we've talked about, like the link to public health and just the concern over livability in our communities. So I think it's a pretty powerful coalition at this point of the different interests, environmental interests, the health interests, livability, even economic interests who really see the value in doing things differently. So I'm hopeful that it's a long, slow process of change, in terms of institutions, let alone what's on the ground. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Can I just
Yeah.
something that happened in Wellington with the activated, because they ran it for 4 years, and they found that at first they were doing these competitions where it was about who could cycle the most, and that was about the lurid clay lycra men, and they found that these were quite turning people off cycling, and so when they actually made it about normal people, and not about cycling 50 kilometers a day, but like 5 or 10 kilometers a day, and you weren't dressed in lycra, but you were dressed like normally, and they told their stories, then it came out that that really increased it. So some of it is also the usual social norming, how you see yourself. Are you a super sporty kind of person? And then if that message comes to you, that may work, but if you're not, you're kind of like, that's not me. I don't associate with that kind of, so,
Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking on that, I wondered, Susan, when you were talking, if you, in your survey, had included any questions to kind of get at someone that maybe said they didn't like to ride a bike, but if attitudinal perceptions of bicyclists, to see whether it was a group, as C was kind of saying, do they identify, can they see themselves within that group, or do they have the young male spandex kind of mentality, or the, I don't want to get out there because I'm gimpy. But one of the things I really like about you doing your research is in many communities, I think it would be more complex for us to divide out the factors because of infrastructure. Because you've got so much infrastructure, you can say, okay, if they're not saying I like to ride a bike, it's not because they don't have a convenient way to go. Whereas in many communities, the fact that they're saying, I don't like to ride a bike, maybe because they've got no bike lanes or path or, way to get around. So it's your kind of unique position to capture that.
All right, so two parts to the question. The second half about Davis being an interesting place to do research because the infrastructure is good. So the fact that people aren't bicycling, it's not because of the infrastructure. So that's the rationale I use. People say, oh, Davis, that's Davis. Nowhere else is like there, so we can't learn anything from there. But I think you're right. I mean, most places, why people aren't bicycling. It's because the conditions are so bad. So there isn't that much to be learned from that. But in Davis, we've done that first step. We've made it possible to bike and to drive less. And so then, then we get into those other more psychological questions and social questions about why aren't people bicycling. And then your kind of the first half of your question.
Did you have questions that would had attitudes about cyclists?
Yeah. So did we in our surveys did we ask about perceptions of cyclists? And we did do some of that. One of our first studies was a survey in Davis, and then 5 other cities, including Boulder, which is sort of second to Davis in terms of how much bicycle commuting there is. What? Portland's pretty good, but a big city. So Boulder is, more Davis scale, smaller city. It's just easier to have more bicycling there. And we think that we were picking up on that issue in Boulder, where there's a lot of the lycra cycling. It's a very sporty community. And in fact, that we had some question that was about perception of, the cyclists in my community. I don't think we said wear lycra, but ride fancy bikes, or there was something like that. And there was some that definitely came up in Boulder in a way it didn't in Davis, because Davis is really a lot about just regular people bicycling, much more like the Netherlands than anywhere else in the U.S. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. We've got some other data we haven't really gotten around to using yet that sort of get at that self-identification as to what kind of, are you a cyclist? I mean, to me, even the term cyclist is, I wouldn't call myself a cyclist because I ride for transportation. I don't do it for recreation on a fast bike and whatever. So I think there's some really interesting questions from that. There's a lot of good work in the UK on that issue, but not so much yet in the US.
Can I just add something on the cultural thing again? Because working with all these different countries, I get a lot of these interesting cultural differences. But in Wellington, for example, we're the windiest city in the world, and we are also incredibly hilly, and we have some of the worst car drivers in the world, and we don't have laws that make the car driver responsible when he bowls over a cyclist. In fact, more often than not, the cyclists are responsible. So there is a war between cyclists and cars, and it's really almost only the lycra-clad lunatics that dare to go out in those conditions, and they literally wage a war against car drivers. And you often hear of cyclists being killed, and it often was quite an antagonistic kind of situation. And when I was trying to write to work as much as possible, I realized that my own identification of myself changed depending if I was in the car or on the bike. If I was in my car, I was like, against these lycra-clad idiots, and if I was on a bike, I was like, this bloody car drivers, you know. And it's I mean, you know, and then I called myself and went, that's ridiculous, but I actually managed to have that schizophrenic kind of split personality. And I think it's when you're in a situation where there is that antagonism, which is a little bit in Copenhagen as well, because if you like walk on the bicycle, like cyclists versus pedestrians, if you walk on the cycle lane in Copenhagen, you will be mowed down. Yeah, so it's quite interesting that splits out. So.
I actually wanted to bring back up a topic that came up a few times and get thoughts from all of you. An intriguing issue is looking at the greenhouse gas targets. We need effectively a massive phase shift in this sector as opposed to small incremental shifts over time if we are to hit any of those charts. And the encouraging ones are the S-type curves of phase shifts that have happened in other areas. I wonder if one trend is the subtle reduction in VMT over time, but the young drivers not taking a driver's license is a global phenomenon with a few exceptions, and I wonder if that's actually a bigger indicator of a future phase shift than the subtle reduction in VMT. And the two reasons, well, you picked up your phone to get onto one of them. I'm sure everyone's heard of various explanations for this topic. The intriguing ones are that in terms of life priorities, this is a bigger priority than a car, and something like that would start to tell a very different cultural story about importance and value. Anytime I talk about these issues in Australia, it takes about 10 seconds before someone says, well, but Australians love their cars, don't they? Which is really a story that we tell about ourselves, right? And I'm not even convinced that the people that say that believe that that is the story. It's just a knee-jerk story of we are the kind of people that love our cars, therefore blah, blah, blah. Maybe there's an emerging change with this sort of newer generation. And the second one is more of an anti-car component, which also relates to the phone, which is you can't text and stay in constant contact while you're driving, or at least you can't do it legally. And if you're on a train or otherwise, you're constantly using your phone and staying in touch as you go. That may be the other partial explanation of shifts away from driver's licenses. But so I wanted to get thoughts from the panel on, this notion of a real phase shift, major change. Is that an indicator or not, or are there others that are out there?
I think I should let the younger folks answer.
Well, not speaking for the younger generation, but I think there's an earlier talk, just anecdotally, that the younger generation is spending like 8 hours with their screens in some form, which is really incredible. But my son is 14, and he's definitely on the computer whenever he can be, and I have to keep him off. And I think the other statistic was that the younger generation is spending hours and hours in front of screens, not TV, but like other forms of screening, like texting or gaming, or an hour and a half on avatar-type activities. But also that they're only spending 38 minutes per day on reading, like a book. So there is a phase shift in the sense of how people are spending their time. And part of this virtual reality session, which is very fascinating, there's a faculty member, I forget his name, from Stanford, I can look it up here, but basically he was saying that with this type of avatar information, that's actually a very powerful capability, because it means that you can see yourself or visualize yourself. Basically, in behavior change, there are two very important factors at play, at least. So there's identification, and then there's also, let's see, what's that?
Vicarious experience.
Yeah, it's just like, you can see that, you can directly experience something. So with virtual reality, there's that capability, and with an avatar, you can actually see yourself. I think transparency is other things, like it's just the directness. So with an avatar, for example, you can see yourself age over time. So Bank of America has an application where they can see yourself, maybe you're a youngster and you can see your appearance in 60 years and say, you will be happier if you put away this amount of money. So there are many factors at play. I mean, that's just a simple example, but it's a fascinating presentation. But I think there are a lot of factors at play which can influence just how people spend their time. And of course the connectivity that we have, and the fact that people travel a lot, and air travel is another one. If there's better technology that can potentially supplant the need for travel around the world for business trips, that could be. I mean, you could imagine that, which just doesn't replace face-to-face connection, of course. But there are technological possibilities.
Yeah, on that last point, I will add that my colleague Pat Octarian has done a lot of work on telecommuting and use of telecommunications as a potential substitute for travel, and every study shows that that's not what's happening, that there's this complementarity. So the more telecommunications we do, the more travel we do. So that great hope went by the wayside.
Plus, I think we're completely going to destroy ourselves by putting wireless into planes and being allowed to keep them mobile, because I swear to God, that's just going to take away the last thing that stops you from not wanting to fly. I mean, rebound is another thing that, we haven't talked about it all, but, with the electric vehicles, with the sexy Teslas and stuff, I mean, you've maxed out the miles on your Cora, and your great electric vehicle and stuff, because they're fun to drive, and it's like, I mean...
I would have flown if I didn't have somebody in town from New Zealand who wanted to go to San Francisco.
And then I ended up flying, and I couldn't be on my phone the whole time I was on the plane.
We've got at least 2 more questions that we want to get to in the green trick. Yep. You.
I run a small rural transit agency in Northeast Florida, out of a county of 70,000 people. 10,000 of them commute to work outside of the county with an average trip length of 43 miles. So we're looking at a carpool project to try to capture some of that and bring it within our system. Are any of you aware of a comprehensive study of liability issues surrounding carpools, not just for passengers and drivers, but for employers that are promoting carpools or people who are managing carpools?
Something for the litigious society, which we are totally not in New Zealand. So, I mean, in New Zealand, the main kind of health and safety motto is just don't be a dick. Seriously, like, we do not sue people if they're on a owner or something like that. So, I think I lived it up to you guys.
So the question is comprehensive or liability studies of liability around promoting carpooling and vanpooling. Not that I am aware of offhand, but it's not really my area. So
Nick, maybe there certainly are some good assessments of this. Do you know any good references?
Yeah, there's a document that was put out probably back in the mid-90s that actually lists all of the ride-sharing laws by state. And in some states there are more defined laws and regulations in terms of how carpooling and vanpooling is defined, and then in other cases, they have information in there in terms of employer liability and the type. So each state's a little bit different. It's almost kind of like a cottage type of a synopsis in terms of what's going on all across the country. But it's available. I think it was a study that was put out by TRB. It was kind of like almost like a compendium of various laws on ride sharing.
And who put it up?
Transportation Research Board.
Do you have still a question in the back?
Yeah, actually I have many, but for Steve, regards to your story about eco-driving, and just to mention, one thing that I saw, the eco-driving has been going on for a long time now, and in Argentina, where I come from, for example, they did what you were saying. They sent people to Switzerland, where the International Road Union is, the IRU, and to be trained and come back. And now there's been more than millions of drivers because it was by law that you couldn't drive a truck unless it was unless you had that training from the federation. So it came by law first that you needed to have, and then the company started because, of course, it takes 20% to 30% fuel reduction, so it became as an economy issue. And I saw, talking about that, I saw that South America is a little light in your...
I'd love to have your case study. I'd love to have it, so definitely.
So I'll share it with you because it's being replicated now in Chile, and the trainers are being trained and more trained. So the president of the federation went to the RU together with two, and now I think we have hundreds of people that have changed others' behavior. But it had to come by law. You couldn't drive a truck if you didn't have it.
See, I got another New Zealand example. I'm just really happy because I'm going to have like a really long with Argentina now. I have another example from the largest transport freight company in New Zealand. So New Zealand Post is the biggest kind of courier company, and then we have another one called Downer Transport, which is the largest freight company. And they drive even more millions of kilometres because New Zealand doesn't have any good rail infrastructure. And so they did a similar thing without laws. It was just company driven, and they used GPS as well. So they were there was kind of a carrot and a stick because they were kind of monitoring their drivers, so they could see where they were going, and they could tell if they were speeding from like how fast they got from A to B and stuff like that. But it was again a training component, and it was again based on trusted peer training. And they managed to also get ongoing reductions of like over 15%. So we've shown with the two largest freight companies in New Zealand that you could do it even without regulation. So. But it'd be very good to have those contrasting cases.
I saw your map, and it was like that. And
love it.
The other one was for weight. Max weight. Yeah. And one of your graphs in where you were passing the S curves, and you were talking about changing takes time, and yet one of your graphs, and I've seen that as well happening, like that was the seat belts. If you see that one, it's not an S, it's almost an I. And I've seen that happening in safety in Australia, and which is, you can see from different countries how it was going up and down in safety on the roads, and then all of a sudden in Australia it came from 2003, I think, to 2004, and came down like this. And when you go and you see why did it come out like that, and it was compulsory, and it was controlled, and that was fatigue was controlled, and in that case for safety it was, and I see that in safety. So I think that it's not for being too much on the stick, but at the end of the day we can have all the legislation that we want, but if there's no control, I don't think that behaviors will change.
No, I agree with you for that particular case. I didn't dwell on that right-hand column of smoking, and I think there's drunk driving and also seatbelts.
Right.
But you're correct. I mean, in places like Iowa or really nationally, when you had the regulation turn on, it was very quick. It was very within 10 years across the country, pretty much that. I forget if it was the usage rate that I was quoting or something else, but there was like a phase change. So that was in less than a decade. But for these other items like smoking reduction, like the number of packs per adult per year, and some of the other ones that I mentioned, recycling and red meat. So those actually did take decades, like of the order of 50 or 60 years. So I was just sharing that information just as points of reference, not suggesting that phase changes have to take that long, but that they're not necessarily going to be turning a switch. I mean, again, it's very much tied to the regulation and what you can impose upon people. It's hard to say, you can only have one worker per household that drives, or you can only, once you, could you have a regulation like if you buy a second refrigerator, it costs 50% more. If you buy a third car, it costs double. I mean, there are a lot of laws in other parts of the world, Singapore, where it's very costly to drive. But here, it's going to be challenging to do that. So Definitely, there's a
I
strong.
think we're going to go ahead and wrap us up today. We've just run out of time. I know the panelists will probably linger around, and you can all talk amongst yourselves as you wish as well. I'd like to certainly thank Beck for allowing us to put this together and for co-sponsoring with us. I'd like to thank Urban Trends for their great support of this event, the TDMI board, and most importantly, I'd like to have you join me in thanking the panel for their presentation.